Under any conceivable scenario, Russia does have the means to basically completely destroy the USA as a country in about 30 minutes. The USA, of course, can do the same to Russia. Any US war planner would have to consider the escalatory potential of any military action against Russia. This still begs the question of whether Russia could challenge the USA militarily if we assume that neither side would be prepared to use nuclear weapons, including tactical ones. Typically, we use the IISS Military Balance or a source like global firepower and tallies of the number of men, main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry combat vehicles, combat aircraft, artillery pieces, bombers, missiles, surface ships, submarines, etc. presented by each side in a chart. The reality is that such bean counting means absolutely and strictly nothing. If a war happens between China and Russia, then the fact that China has 1,000 tanks in its Yunnan province will make no difference to the war at all, simply because they are too distant. When we apply this caveat to the Russian-US conventional military balance, we immediately ought to ask ourselves the following questions. What part of the US military worldwide would be immediately available to the US commanders in case of a war with Russia? On how many reinforcements could this force count and how soon could they get there? Keep in mind that tanks, bombers, soldiers and artillery do not fight separately, they fight together in what is logically called combined arms battles. So even if the USA could get X number of soldiers to location A, if they don't have all the other combined arms components to support them in combat, they are just an easy target. Furthermore, any fighting force will require a major logistics effort. It is all very well to get aircraft X to location A, but if its missiles, maintenance equipment and specialists are not there to help, they are useless. Armored forces are notorious for expending a huge amount of petroleum, oil and lubricants. According to one estimate, in 1991 a U.S. armored division could sustain itself for only 5 days. After that it would need a major resupply effort. Finally, any force that the U.S. would move from point A to point B would become unavailable to execute its normally assigned role at point A. Now consider that point A could mean the Middle East, or Far East Asia, and you will see that this might be a difficult decision for U.S. commanders. We have one very good example of how the U.S. operates, Operation Desert Shield. During this huge operation it took the U.S. 6 months and an unprecedented logistical effort to gather the forces needed to attack Iraq. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia had been prepared for decades to receive such a massive force, in compliance with the so-called Carter Doctrine, and the U.S. efforts was completely unopposed by Saddam Hussein. In case of war with Russia, which country neighboring Russia would have an infrastructure similar to the one of the KSA, pre-positioned equipment, huge bases, runways, deep ports, etc.? How likely is it that the Russians would give the USA 6 months to prepare for war without taking any action? One might object that not all wars run according to the heavy scenario of Desert Storm. What if the US was preparing a very light military intervention using only US and NATO immediate or rapid reaction forces? The Russians have no fear of the military threat posed by NATO. Their reaction to the latest NATO moves, new bases and personnel in Central Europe, more spending, etc., is to denounce it as provocative, but Russian officials all insist that Russia can handle the military threat. As one Russian deputy said, 5 rapid reaction diversionary groups is a problem we can solve with 1 missile. A simplistic but basically correct formula. The decision to double the size of the Russian airborne forces and to upgrade the elite 45th Special Designation Airborne Regiment to full brigade size has already been taken. Russia preempted the creation of the 10,000-strong NATO force by bringing her own mobile, airborne, forces from 36,000 to 72,000. This is typical Putin. While NATO announces with fanfare and fireworks that NATO will create a special rapid reaction spearhead force of 10,000, Putin quietly doubles the size of the Russian airborne forces to 72,000. The battle-hardened Russian airborne forces are a vastly more capable fighting force than the hedonistic and demotivated multinational Euro force of 5,000 NATO is struggling hard to put together. The U.S. commanders fully understand that. There is, of course, another model available to the U.S. commanders, the shock and awe model, massive cruise missile attacks backed by bomber strikes. But, bombing Russia is not comparable to bombing Iraq, and that the Russian air defenses are the most formidable on the planet. The USA has an excellent record of success when bombing civilians. Its record against a military force like the Serbian Army Corps in Kosovo was an abject failure. Even the US succeeded in its favorite remote warfare. Does anybody believe that this would seriously affect the Russian military or breaking the will of the Russian people? The people of Leningrad survived 900 days of an infinitely worse siege and bombing and never even considered surrendering. The reality is that being on the defense gives Russia a huge advantage against the USA, even if we only consider conventional weapons. Even if the conflict happened in the Ukraine or the Baltic states, geographic proximity would give Russia a decisive advantage over any conceivable US-NATO attack. American commanders all understand that very well, even if they pretend otherwise. A Russian attack on the USA or NATO is just as unlikely, and for the same reasons. Russia cannot project her power very far from her borders. Russian bombers, surface ships and submarines reaching much further, but these are also typical, showing the flag missions, not combat training for actual military scenarios. The sole real purpose of the US military is to regularly beat up on some small, more or less defenseless country, either in order to rob it of its resources, overthrow a government daring to defy the world hegemon, or just to make an example of it. The US military was never designed to fight a major war against a sophisticated enemy. Only the US strategic nuclear forces are tasked to defend the USA against another nuclear power or actually fight in a major war. The Russian military, it was designed to be purely defensive, and it has no capability to threaten anybody in Europe, much less so the United States. Of course, the Western corporate media will continue to count US and Russian forces, but that is pure propaganda designed to create a sense of urgency and fear in the general public. The reality for the foreseeable future will remain that neither the USA nor Russia have the means to successfully attack each other, even with only conventional forces. The only real danger left is an unprepared and unforeseen sudden escalation which will lead to a confrontation neither side wants nor is prepared for. The Israeli attack on Lebanon in 2006 or the Georgian attack on Russian peacekeepers in 2008 are two scary reminders that sometimes dumb politicians take fantastically dumb decisions,